Okay, well, what I want to look at now is your choice of variety. We've heard a lot about monitoring and what you can do once you've monitored your pests and diseases. But obviously, once you've, as far as choice of variety is concerned, that's got to be based on historic information, because you've got to then make a choice as to which variety you grow. As far as what we're doing, though, with monitoring of new varieties is then we're collecting more data, which then has to be interpreted to hopefully help improve, make a better decision for the next year. Now, what I've done here is put the various areas I'm going to look at in Gareth's everyday risk language. I think the dread is standing up here, but everything else has a home. You've got, what I want to look at is the challenges of seasonal yields and what we do about that. Protein, particularly with milling wheats and the variability you can get with proteins. Selecting a malting barley variety, which has, for those of you who are unaware of growing malting barley and you're thinking of dabbling in it, there's big dangers there. Some variations in the yields we find in the north, and also how you make your decision as to when you move away from the Old Faithfuls, Santiago and Diego, and move on to something a little newer. So, first of all, what Ellie has done for me here, we've taken a range of varieties. The varieties remain stable, but the seasons have changed. And here we have the wheat. These are treated wheat trials, and as you can see, there 2012 stands out as being a miserable year. But as you can see, the varieties have not changed, but overall the seasons over the last 2 or 3 years have provided you with better yields. Again, if you look at a similar thing with winter barley, there it's actually 2013, which was the worst year. And again, with spring barley, I should have had that box just so I can see here. And with oilseed rape, we have 4 years worth of data. There's an interesting comment about how the north yields versus the south yields. And I just noticed this earlier to see, well, actually, they're just following each other. The north yields just slightly below. But last year, they kind of went the other way. So we need to keep an eye on that one. Right. This one is exactly the same scale, and this is the winter wheat untreated yields. And straight away you can see that the yields have dropped. Obviously the quality's dropped, but you can see as far as your variability is concerned, that is improved. And so you can see, for example, you've got your resilience in a bottle as far as your fungicides are concerned. But if you lose those for certain reasons, then you can see relying on the varieties alone with the current underlying disease resistance could be a bit of a danger. This looks a bit of a nightmare, but I just want you to look at variety A and variety B. This is work which BIOS have done for us. We're trying to understand a little bit more about a variability of a variety. So these are the average yields over 5 years. And for variety A, you can see in the northeast of the UK, the yield tends to be lower compared to the yields in other regions. Variety B, on the other hand, seems to do pretty well in all 3 regions. And what we want to do is to see, well, can we get a measure for this? Can this actually help us find out more about the variety? And for the matter, help you select a variety? And what they were looking at, I've just got variety A and B there, they are different groups. Variety A is actually a quality wheat, so you could say, who cares how it does in the north? That's not where the main market is. You would care if East Anglia got an Aberdeenshire summer, but overall, they're the sort of risks which, in effect, you're happy to take. But the measures look at 2 things. One is the sensitivity of the variety, and that is, well, how well does it do in different regions, different sow dates, different parts of the rotations. And the other is the stability, and that's really how it performs with its equals. Or in other words, is it always in the top 5, or for that matter, always in the bottom 5? Now, at a Monitor Farm meeting, I know Tim's talking about these later, it was really earlier in the late last week, a lot of them said they like variety B. I hadn't presented any of this, but they said they like variety B as a second wheat crop. So they had pinpointed themselves from their own experience that variety B actually seems to deliver what they want in a range of circumstances. far as this consistency concerns, does it matter? And as I mentioned, well, it may not matter, for example, if you know that a variety is unpredictable in a region where you're not necessarily growing it, but we do need to try and find out why that variety might be inconsistent. Now I want to look at how you might go about selecting a new feed wheat variety. The reason for picking feed wheat here is that we're less interested in what end users feel. So in effect, because that's a whole different issue, which we'll come on to later. As far as the recommended list is concerned, you could say it's a nightmare. It's selecting varieties by a committee. But in effect, there are fairly clear guidelines set out, and these change and they evolve because in effect it's the experts who set them. And it's no surprise to know that the guidelines you have for quality wheat will be very different from those from a feed wheat, because with a quality wheat, what the end user wants is obviously king. Just so long as you're aware, because it did come up before, aspects on here, as you can see, you've got yellow rust being of medium importance and septoria very high importance. Now you could say, well, you might see those as an equally important threat to your crop. But as it stands, and as you heard earlier, Jenna said, well, overall, we know with yellow rust, the durability of the varieties can be very much more erratic. But the thing is, with yellow rust, currently we have more, you could say, more fungicides in order to manage that risk. But obviously you need to deal with the monitoring aspects. And that's why septoria is a higher risk, because actually we have real challenges in controlling the disease. Something else which Jen has been looking at is this combination of untreated yield and disease. Okay, you don't have an untreated crop, but it does help us try and identify varieties which are likely to drop further due to potentially having a bad year regarding disease. So you saw before that we have the relative importance of different diseases, and obviously straw strength is of importance, and we have 1 to 9 ratings. So what you can do is weight the importance with the rating and provide an agronomic merit rating. The higher the merit rating, then overall the better the agronomics of that variety. We also have untreated yield, and we can measure this. We sometimes can look at the difference between the treated and untreated yield, but in this case just purely the untreated yield. So varieties in that top right-hand low risk box, from historic data, and that's the important thing because things can change, but based on previous data, have an overall better agronomic package, and also, if left untreated throughout trials, has a relatively higher untreated yield. So let's put the group 4 wheats on the graph here. The square, the cross wires, is in effect the average. So that's the average of the recommended list. And let's put in the varieties which you're probably quite happy to grow. Santiago is a very high yielding variety when treated. Okay, that's not what this is about. It's very much about what would happen if things potentially go wrong. And overall, it's potentially a higher risk variety, but it's a variety you've got a lot of experience with. Then we've got Reflection. That came on the recommended list last year. And this year we have 2 new varieties, KWS Crispin and Graham. So they're higher up the table, but you've got less confidence in those varieties. So the question is, do you stick with the devil you know, or do you jump to something which potentially may be lower risk, but which you have little experience of? I don't know the answer to that. I'm just trying to bring this about. And you could say, well, if you've got your fungicides and you're happy with your program, then does it matter? But as you're aware that things can rapidly change. So what data do we have? Well, we have a treated yield. These are based on a percentage of the control varieties. So I've got here Santiago, Diego, Reflection, Graham and Siskin. Straight away the dashes show that we have less data from less seasons on those new varieties. 2012 was a very interesting year. And if you look there, Reflection did particularly well in that year. Now, you might say, well, does that mean that if you look at the averages, is it sort of fairly average in other years and it just does particularly well in those bad years? But overall, no, it does pretty well. But if we end up with another 2012, chances are that will do well. But it does lead to the challenge here. You can see also with Septoria triticale resistance, there's been a push to get better resistance in the varieties. And you can see with Graham and Siskin, they are higher than the other three. And potentially that's reflected in the untreated yield because Septoria triticale overall is common in all of our trials. So you have at one end the varieties you've got most experience with, and at the other, those with less experience but better agronomics. So really it's a matter of your perception of risk, and for that matter, whether you're willing to perhaps try some of these newer varieties a little sooner than you might have done in the past. Moving on to a different subject now, and that's milling wheat. And what I have here are the current NABIM Group 1 and Group 2 milling wheats. And these are in yield order. So you've got Lily with the highest yield down to Solstice. And these are the percentage proteins from the recommended list trials. And not surprisingly, you can see there's a kind of in the middle, you've got the lower yielding varieties tend to produce the higher protein. There's always been a comment with the recommended list, not all trials are grown to a milling spec. That's true. It was interesting that I saw that Market Intelligence at AHDB, they do a survey, and overall the average for the milling wheats is around 11.8 to 12%. That's actually very similar to the RL trials. We do, however, have milling strips, and we in effect with those, it's a matter of making sure that the nitrogen goes on at the right time to increase the protein levels. So it's just to be aware that with for example, Illustrious, then we were getting higher protein levels than we get from our general recommended list trials. That's total protein, and I know that the higher the protein, then there's obviously the chances are you're going to get the right sort of protein. But this is where I started to do some more homework. This is not my area of expertise, but I'm always willing to learn something new. It's to find out, well, actually, it's not just total protein, it's the right sort of protein or the functional protein that's required. And overall, what you require your glutenins and the gliadins in the right proportion for your end use. And depending on whether it's, say, a pizza dough or, for that matter, a bread, then obviously those ratios will change. For example, with the glutenins, you get the elasticity, whilst with the gliadins, you tend to get the extensibility of your dough. And it's really that ratio which gives you the good bread. We did some work with Camden to see, well, are we measuring the right things? Maybe total protein in itself is not the best way to go. And they were looking at HPLC measures, where in effect what they do is once you've got your protein, you can then differentiate it out on the basis of the molecular weight, and you find you then get your glutenins, your gliadins, and then your what they call the non-functional proteins. And what you require is obviously the right ratio of your functional ones and less of the non-functional ones. So it's not just purely about whether you get 12.5 or 13% protein. Don't worry about too much the dots here, but this just shows if you've got varieties 1, 2, and 3, the good news is that as far as the protein profiles are concerned, is that each variety is different, and we can then get a measure of the ratio of these the two types of proteins using this methodology. But as I mentioned, that's just the variety. We now bring in the environmental effects, because I was quite intrigued to see whether in effect the environment was also impacting on the protein quality and, for that matter, quantity. So we've just got an example of 3 varieties, and we took extreme sites. We took actually Cornwall, not necessarily well known for its bread making wheat, but we got the highest total protein there, probably because it's the most fertile area they're going. I'm not saying it makes good bread wheat, because obviously there are other issues such as Hagberg to deal with, but we just wanted to extend things out. And we found that in that site where we've got the site DC, we found it had in effect overall, the lowest proportion of the non-functional protein of the other sites. And what perhaps surprised me was the site in the east had a slightly different proportion. I think this is important to go alongside the baking tests, because if you can imagine you've got your flour and it may or may not make a good loaf, And the question is that down to the variety, or is it just the way it's been managed? And that's what I'm really quite interested to learn, tease this apart a bit more. Likewise, you can see with variety 2, this particular variety, you can see there is a gap between the two sites, but if you compare that with variety 1, then there are distinctive differences. And likewise with this variety 3, that happens to be a soft variety, so for a completely different market. So it looks like understanding a bit more about the variety components might help us assist the quality of the protein. That in itself is not enough, and again what Camden can do with very small quantities of grain, which again this is probably more useful for a breeder who's got lots and lots of varieties, you can make a dough out of that, so you understand the protein content and composition, and then understand, well, what sort of a dough does it make? And this is the important bit, and the bit we test for, and it's just to be aware that it's not just the variety which makes a loaf, but also the type, the environment as well, and that could be not necessarily just purely down to the protein level, but the quality of the protein. The other thing now I want to look at here is the north, where we occasionally get some odd results. This is based on just a few varieties, and you've got their yield in the east based over 5 years, the north over 5 years, and the east over 5 years, so that's what we've got. We then look at individual trial sites. We got some really high yields last year, and there's 2 sites from east of Scotland, pretty good yields. And again, they're following a similar pattern in yield. And then we got this one, where in effect, this particular site, you can see that the yields are very different, but it's a real effect, so it's used in the data set. But what it means is that we need to try and understand, well, what happened there? And it probably comes back to an earlier slide I showed you, where sometimes some varieties don't do well in the north. We do have sterility trials, and where this is measured, you can see in this situation that the level of sterility in the variety mirrors the yield. Now, this is another example as to where you've got both the varietal component and also the environmental component. And there's a big danger here in taking one trial in one season and making any conclusions, because in effect, who's to say that if you've got slightly different weather patterns due to a slightly different flowering pattern of another variety, then the whole lot got turned on its head. So you can then start to see, well, what other information have we got? We have a few trials from 2009 to 2015, and actually you can see Gallant here in most years, and not in those particular areas, there is an issue. And then if you think, well, Viscount, that's a variety very popular in the north, does very well, but you can see that variety too can be affected in certain areas in certain seasons, and likewise with Invicta. And it's really just a matter of, the more information you have, then it may well come down to, well, with Viscount, you take the risk. And with other potential varieties, you may not necessarily take the risk. But you can see you just don't take 1 year's worth of trials, because from some of those years in 2013 and 14, the overall levels are low, in other years when a lot of varieties were equally affected. And more to the point, in the same season, 2 sites not that far apart can give you very different results. And that's why I know that growers like to see local regional trials and then draw conclusions from it. But just be aware, it's actually overall, if you have a 5-year data set based on a lot more data, you're probably going to get a more realistic view as to how that variety can perform. Spring barley, this is a slightly different way now as far as the risk's concerned. Here's a recommended list with lots of brand shiny new varieties on it, all with a new on top. But buyer beware, or in other words, the first thing is, what does the end market want? And that's very critical if you're going for a malting barley contract, is to find out what someone's going to buy from you. Because what you'll probably find is that the varieties they're going to look at are at the boring end of the table, the lower end, where in fact the disease resistance scores may not look all that great. And those 3 varieties, they went on in 2008, 9 and 10, but they're going to buy it. Anything with a brand new on it, they have little information. I know there may not be much seed, but overall, it is very much, if this is a new area to you, find out what your end user wants. And this helps, actually, if you can find the MAGB barley purchases. This is a good indicator as to what they're currently buying. This is up to 2014, but it's useful to find out, well, actually, Concerto's still there. It's a big variety. It's the bottom end of the table, but that's what they're buying. Odyssey seems to be a variety which is starting to be on the increase. You can see Tipple is very much on the decrease. And with winter varieties, Venture appears to be on the increase, Flagons sort of standing around there on the flat side. None of those shiny new varieties are actually there at all. And something which MAGB have is what they call the stairway to heaven regarding their new varieties. And in effect, those varieties which got recommended this year are just on their first steps regarding that, getting the end user confidence into the market. And the varieties which got on last year are still at a provisional stage. So it's very much a matter of, even last year's varieties, if somebody has given you a cast iron contract for them, that's fine. But if they haven't, then please don't pick a variety and assume you're going to get something for it. There are other aspects here which may come up in the challenges. You have to feel sympathy for breeders, actually. It doesn't matter what the crop is, but potentially with malting barley, we're trying to produce whiskey in the next, 10 to 15 years? And in effect, what the challenges they have, first thing is, they've got to get a variety which produces the yield, and also specific weight is something which the industry want, particularly after 2012. It's got to obviously provide them with the spirit yield they want. They also want skinning resistance. I've taken those slides out of this talk. That's another aspect where you've got a variety and an environmental aspect, and where we require more research to be done on that one. But unfortunately, Concerto, which is their big number 1 variety, the chances are that we've had weather patterns which have led to an increase in skinning in the last years or so. Also, we want pest and disease resistance, and likewise, we want a short stiff variety. We want early maturity as well. And on that basis, then they have to deal with whatever the environment throws at them, various extremes of weather, or for that matter, different rotations, and the word stability that's come in there too. Now, alongside that, you've got market influences. There may be innovations which help us. It could be ag chem innovations, or it could be different ways of managing the crop, or for that matter, forecasting how you get an accurate forecast. But I think you can see overall there are quite a lot of challenges for the plant breeder. So what I've done is it's sort of a whirlwind tour of a few challenges here, is shown you with the challenges we have with seasonal yields, which on the whole in the last 2 or 3 years have been going up. So we may be in for a bit of a shock if we find that this coming year is very different. Who's to say? Selecting new wheat varieties is an interesting one as to when do you have the confidence to move away from those, say the Santiagos on the feeds, to try something new. I mean, obviously, you'll be crazy if you say, well, okay, Santiago's done well the last 3 or 4 years, I'll go wholesale into something else. That's crazy. But when do you start to look at a new variety? And also, what are the risks in trying to get a feel for that? And let's be honest, if you have a new variety, it's hard work. Actually, dealing with a susceptible variety is easy. You protect it. We know, well, potentially this year, yellow rust, got a mild winter. If you've got a variety that's susceptible, you apply a cheap and cheerful T0 and you go on from there. How do you deal with a variety which on paper, from previous experience, overall has better resistance? And that, I think, is where obviously the monitoring becomes very important, not just on whether the disease is in the crop, but if there have been any changes regarding the populations. So actually moving to a new variety really is hard work. And I want to thank Just thank you for listening to me.